Hi class, and welcome to this video on Year 12 VCE Economics, Unit 4 Outcome 1. In this video, we are going to continue our work on budgetary policy and budget outcomes. But in this video, we're going to look at what governments are going to do, so government actions when there is a budget outcome. So what are governments going to do specifically if they have a budget surplus or a budget deficit? Now you can see that this is our fourth key knowledge point of this outcome. So previous videos discussed what budgetary policy is, revenues and expenses, and what a budget deficit or surplus is. So you might want to relook at those videos if you're not sure about those topics. And as I said, the purpose of this video, the learning intention, what do I want you to get out of it? What is a government going to do? What are their options if they have a government deficit? How are they going to finance it? And if they have a surplus, what are they going to do or utilize with that surplus? So let's have a quick recap on what I mean by a budget deficit or a budget surplus. And we're going to now start to use different terminology, expansionary and contractionary budgets. Now, the reason why I'm using those terms is because governments have often made these decisions specifically for a specific reason. Budget surpluses and deficit affect or impact aggregate demand. So they actually impact GDP and the size of the economy. And we're now going to start to recognize that these deficits and surpluses are deliberate decisions often. And hence, a government has made a decision. Are we going to expand the economy and have an expansionary budget, or contract the economy and have a contractionary budget? So what is a budget deficit? Very quickly, this is when the amount of receipts or revenues are less than the expenses. So more expenses than receipts. Now, because we are spending more than we're receiving, we are going to say that this is expansionary, as there is more spending than receipts, and this should expand the economy and expand aggregate demand. Budget surpluses are the opposite. This is where the value of the receipts or revenues are more than the expenses or outlays. This is a contractionary budget because there is less spending than what we're receiving. So the government has made a decision to reduce aggregate demand, reduce GDP, reduce the size of the economy, often because inflation is too high. So the amount of this budget surplus or deficit differs year on year. So we might start to recognize that even if there is a deficit, a government could actually be trying to take a contractionary approach. So if a government, for example, delivers a bigger surplus than before, it's taking a contractionary stance because it's making a bigger surplus than last year. So it's even trying to contract it even more. If a deficit, and this is badly spelt, is bigger than the previous year, they're taking an expansionary stance. But if a deficit is smaller than the year before, we might start to recognize that a government is trying to contract the economy a little bit, trying to move towards a surplus. So starting to understand that is important. Now, the important bit is, what does a government do? What are their actions? When a government is in deficit, the government needs to raise funds because they're spending more than they're receiving. So they need to get that money somewhere. Now, there's three ways a government can finance this deficit. They can borrow from overseas. They could borrow from the Reserve Bank of Australia or create money, and we combine them. Or they could borrow from the Australian public. Now, the key bit before we go into these, and we'll go through this quickly, even though there's quite a bit of information on this slide, is that because all of them say borrow, that means the government is going to have to pay interest on this debt. So there is a downside, I guess, due to a deficit. Governments are going to have to pay, because they're borrowing money, interest. Now, they can borrow from overseas, and this is where the government or treasury, which is the part of the government that controls the money, may borrow from entities overseas. Now, they do this by doing something called selling an Australian government bond. A government bond is just something where they sell it, so they get money. So they might sell $1 billion of bonds. So people will give Australian government $1 billion. And a bond will then say in a future date, 1 year, 2 years, the government will give you that money back plus interest. So that's why it's going to, they have to pay interest. So if it's $1 billion, they will sell them for $1 billion. They will give $1 billion back to these investors maybe in 2 years' time, plus interest. So what happens if we borrow overseas? First things to recognizing, this borrowing adds to our net foreign debt. It may actually increase the demand for the Australian dollar because foreign entities have to convert their currency into Australian dollars to buy our bonds. And this could cause the demand for the Australian dollar to appreciate. And in the short term, there's actually some negative effects to that. This could reduce our international competitiveness of our exports. Because if our dollar is up, as appreciated, our exports may be less competitive. So there might be some unwanted impacts of this. Furthermore, it's going to increase our interest payments, and hence it's going to increase the size of our current account deficit. So that is one option, but there are some impacts of that. The other option is to borrow from the Reserve Bank of Australia, so borrow from within Australia, particularly the Reserve Bank. They might do there are two possibilities to do this. They could use up any savings that they already have. So they could have had surpluses in the past, so they had savings with the Reserve Bank. Or they could start to sell bonds to the Reserve Bank in the same way. Unfortunately, that means they will have to repay this money with interest at the future date. So just because you're borrowing from a Reserve Bank of Australia, you still have to pay interest. Now, the government could decide to print money. Remember, the unique part of the government is they could just print the money. So that $20 billion in deficit, they could just create $20 billion more and give it. Why wouldn't they do that? It's regarded as very expansionary and often one of the last options, because by adding money into circulation, we're going to increase spending, and that often creates significant inflation and often unsustainable inflation, which has negative impacts on the economy. Now, the other option is they might not want to borrow from the Reserve Bank, but they might want to keep it within Australia. They might borrow from the Australian public or the financial sector. This is a sound option since the money is withdrawn from the private sector. That is withdrawn is returned when they pay it back. However, the downsides is that this approach could cause upward pressure on interest rates, as the government is now competing for limited savings. So if the savers in Australia are going, well, there's someone else trying to get my money, they will start to raise their interest rates because the demand for their cash is more. And it also may depress private sector investment spending and economic activity because they are giving the money to the government as opposed to using it to invest. And this might artificially reduce aggregate demand. So there's a lot to think about. But if you're going to have a deficit, you're going to have to get the money somewhere. You're going to have to get it from one of these options, and you will have to pay interest on this debt. The first thing to recognize is often these deficits are necessary when economic activity is weak. It's important that we create an expansionary budget to increase the size of our economy and to increase aggregate demand and GDP. There is generally a problem if we keep having deficits though. And there is a necessity to return to a budget surplus over the medium term as our economic conditions recover, as this expansionary budget has done what it should do. Why should we do this? Because budget deficits add to our debt. And this can build up and even get out of hand. And in some countries like Greece, Spain, and Japan, it became unsustainable and credit ratings can be impacted. If our credit rating goes down, we have higher interest rates. And so we not only have deficits, the debt that we're borrowing is going to cost us more, and it's quite a spiral. Having ongoing deficits means that we have to pay interest. And that is going to mean that we're going to have less money to spend on things that we really want to spend on, like education, welfare, and health. And these persistent budget deficits can impact the government's ability to deal with crises, borrow more money. It actually is not sustainable to keep doing this. So the message is it's often necessary, but ongoing large budgets would typically be considered unsustainable. And eventually we'll need to go back to a surplus, have higher taxes, reduce how much we're spending, and this can have an impact on our living standards. So governments don't want to do this on an ongoing matter. They want to get back to surpluses. And this is when economy activity is strong and there is high inflationary pressures. The government will typically take a contractionary approach and have a surplus where revenues are higher than spending. So they're going to recognize that we're not going to spend as much money. We're going to save our money, maybe even use that money effectively by reducing debt. And we recognize it's not going to grow our economy as much, but maybe our economy is growing too fast in a non-sustainable way. So if we have a surplus, there is really three options that a government can do. They could firstly reduce debt, which is really important because we've just talked about deficits. We have to borrow money and paying back that interest. So paying back this debt is a viable way to reduce those interest payments. They could decide to save the money with the Reserve Bank, essentially giving the money to the Reserve Bank and build up what we might say is a fighting fund for a rainy day. Having the money for future uses. It might be a recession that happens, a financial crisis, a natural disaster that they need to use the money that they didn't plan. It could be a way to finance deficit budgets in the future. So there is that option there. The other option is to add this money to investment balances in special savings funds. Often countries, and Australia does this, has specific investment funds where they are saving money for future things, investments that they know are important. These are often nation-building funds to benefit current and future generations. For example, the Australian has an investment fund to do large infrastructure projects, and it's called the Future Fund. And in 2017, this was created, and it's all about having money set aside so they can fund future nation-building projects, the National Broadband Network, for example. I suspect in the future they might need to do something around energy, and they might use those funds there. So using surpluses when they have more receipts than expenses, putting it in a special fund for a specific purpose that they know is going to be beneficial. Now, there are advantages to being able to run a surplus. They offset our deficit. It means if we have a deficit, we don't need to go to the public sector to borrow or take out more debt. It's hoped that these might be sustainable, and it's going to not create a burden for future generations because we're not going to ask future generations to pay the debt. The surplus allows the government, as I said, to build up a fighting fund. It allows us to better deal with crises and issues in the future. The surpluses help our credit rating. And the credit ratings are incredibly important. Australia has the best credit rating possible, AAA. It's one of only a few countries that does it. And these surpluses are showing to those credit agencies that we're a well-run country that can pay back their debt on time, and hence the interest rates that we have to pay in our debt is very low. This allows us to get debt cheaply, allows us to use that debt, hopefully effectively, to build infrastructure, and it's cheap. These surpluses also help the confidence that future investors, future international investors have. So it helps support our international confidence among our investors and helps us be a country that foreign investors are happy to invest in. Now, this is a very busy slide and I'm not going to go through all of it, but it's important to understand that the budgets are an estimate. When estimating a particular budget outcome, the government or the treasurer has made some assumptions about the likely receipts and expenses in the year ahead. They're based on the best information and forecasts available to them, often provided by independent agencies like Treasury, and they are often correct, but sometimes they are not. So sometimes the budget, and in fact, very often, the budget outcome expected or estimated is not going to be the actual budget outcome. Now, there's lots of reasons why, and this slide goes through a number of reasons. For example, the rate of economic growth that was predicted might be slower or faster than they expected. The unemployment rate might be different. The commodity prices that drive a lot of our tax receipts and company profits could be different, could rise and fall. Business profits could change. Global politics could impact our ability to trade with different countries. Laws and politics can change. Natural disasters can significantly impact our economy and impacts in confidence. Lots of things can change. And the best example is COVID. The government was actually predicting a surplus for the first time in many years. And then in the end, because COVID came, they gave not a surplus, but the biggest budget deficit in the history of Australia. So things change, and you might want to pause and have a read of this slide to understanding all the ways that the budget outcome can differ when it actually happens. But for now, I hope that you found this video useful and it's given you an understanding again of budget deficits and surpluses. But now you also understand the government actions that they need to consider when making a deficit and a surplus and the potential outcome or impacts to the Australian economy.